Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today for Landlord Strategies for Tenants Seeking Rent Relief. My name is Jackie Matsumura, and I am a tax partner here at BPM and the co-leader of our real estate industry group. And I will be your moderator for today. So I would like to introduce you to the panel speakers. We have three this morning. First, Mark Leverette. He is a BPM Assurance and Advisory Partner, as well as co-leader of the real estate group with me. He works with private equity funds, REITs, developers, and construction companies. Welcome, Mark.
Happy to be here, Jackie.
And then next is Craig Hamm. Craig is a BPM Advisory Partner who leads BPM's Transaction Advisory Group. He has served startup companies to Fortune 500 companies in the real estate, services, technology, and venture capital industries. Craig, good morning.
Good morning to you as well.
And Abe Valdez Bravo is a senior lead economist and director within BPM's Economic Consulting Group. Hi, Abe.
Hello, good morning. Happy and excited to be here.
Thank you all panelists for joining and sharing some useful information with us. Let's get started. I'm going to ask questions to our panelists and they can share information with us. So my first question is for Mark. The general understanding is that there is no legal obligation or right to consider rent relief, but why do you think landlords and tenants are pursuing it?
Jackie, I think that everybody on the call, being that they came here to learn a little bit about the rent relief process, is understanding that there actually might be a slight requirement, a legal obligation. I am not an attorney, and we'll talk a little bit about the team that you need to form in this process. And many people on the call have already formed a somewhat of a team and hopefully have talked with their attorneys. So I'm not going to talk on the legal side. But there certainly has been a moratorium on eviction, and there has been an ability for tenants to not pay in many jurisdictions. And this is a geography-based set of rules. And so depending on the city or county and in certain states, you might have different requirements. But sitting around the table and coming up with a solution is something that's age-old. And the worst thing that can happen is that you end up with a vacant space. So the question being, why should you consider rent relief? It's because of those costs: vacancy, the cost to broker the new space, the TI improvements that might need to go in. And again, if we're talking residential, we're talking one set of rules and one set of costs, and we're talking office or industrial or retail, we're talking a whole set of other costs. Hopefully that gives you some insight into what you should be concerned about while you consider sitting down at the table.
It's important to consider that there's an incentive, economic incentive between landlords and tenants to get to the table, discuss this. We believe that that's the optimal solution for both parties. So there's this incentive to maximize your profits with your current situation. Right now, our environment is very unique. It's very uncertain. So the incentive to get on the table and start the discussion, it's the best option to get to an efficient result.
Thank you. Well, Craig, so based on your experience, can you share some of the key parts of the process that is important from an efficiency and legal standpoint?
Sure. One thing that came to mind when you showed us our bios is that I'm long overdue for a haircut. I think I recognize myself. So in regards to a process, I kind of look at rent relief as kind of like an M&A transaction. There's going to be a natural tension between tenant and landlord, where it's human nature that one's going to try to, without even knowing it, will try to one up the other and get some type of gain over each other. And that can be overwhelming for a landlord. And just the dynamics of it and the level of request could just become overwhelming. So I think therefore there needs to be an internal process in place that kind of creates consistency for the landlord for decision making that's scalable. And it also needs to be fair to the tenants, because you can just assume that various tenants are going to talk amongst each other. And if one got one deal, the other got the other deal, but the landlord doesn't really have a process that's well documented or well followed through, that could just be a recipe for disaster. And so a process that's consistent, scalable, and documented just could go a long way. The key is really to avoid one-offs, that a landlord may have a one-off deal with one tenant and not the other. And that's something you probably should stay away from. But if you have something that's well documented and a process that's followed, that could go a long way.
We don't have a crystal ball where this is going. In fact, the PPP loan money is running out. So many of those businesses that might have been able to continue to pay might start come knocking. And quite frankly, in residential real estate, we might actually see stimulus money drying up and those tenants coming. It's important that you think about what are you going to do when they come, and be consistent, like what Craig said. There were a few laws that actually got recently in the last week got stopped in legislature, including Scott Wiener's SB 939. And I know that a few of the landlords out there are probably fist bumping right now that didn't pass. I mean, there was a lot of opposition in that bill. And the result is that we have a little bit more time to have those real conversations and to structure the solutions in a way that leverages the original rules of engagement around leases. So I think that Craig's process he's talking about is something for you to have in place and ready, and start having those conversations efficiently.
Absolutely. I would like to add a few comments to that. Completely agree that the process needs to be scalable, also repeatable, because following up your answer from the poll, just starting the webinar, where you have seen that most of you have been, your tenant has requested rent relief, it's going to be a little bit overwhelming. So there are a lot of balls out there in the air. The environment is very dynamic. So if you have a process that can actually identify and do the analytics for understanding what's the current situation for you as a landlord and also for your tenants, it will be just a little bit more easier to come up to a final decision, to an efficient decision, if you have the process in place to identify and to put on the table what are all the options available and what are the limitations that each party has.
Okay. And when you first talk to landlords to help them develop that process and just digest their current situation, Craig, can you think of any common issues or items that are often overlooked by landlords regarding their rent relief requests?
Yes, the most often overlooked items are, the tenants are providing data to the landlords to analyze, figure out solutions or potential solutions. And what's often overlooked is the validity and the accuracy of that financial information. And so if a landlord and the tenant are going to try to find common ground to come up with solutions, we got to go back to the basics and say, okay, well, is the information I'm getting from you, tenant, is it really accurate? And are they valid? So there's a big aspect of trust but verify that needs to happen. So decisions are made and you're using the right information to make the right decisions. And this need will change based on the sophistication of the tenant and the landlord. Some tenants may have great financial reporting, so it's easy to make decisions. Some may not. Some may have, poor financial statements and financial information that it'd be hard to do analysis on and make decisions. For example, we had a client where the city of San Francisco needed us to understand the financial health of a spin out of a Fortune 500 company, which wasn't publicly traded. So access to information was hard to get. And so our client needed us to get them comfort that they had the financial wherewithal and ability to complete a development. So it's things like that. It's just getting comfort of just a simple, are the financial information you're getting valid and accurate?
And on top of that, you want to make sure that you have the right decision-making team, and that this decision-making team starts well in advance of these conversations. So structuring how you're going to request and digest and conclude on the information is important. Designing that process should involve your brokers for the specific geography and product type. It should involve your attorneys that also have that expertise. On the financial analysis side, it's one thing before a tenant moves into space to do kind of a standard credit check and feel comfortable about who's moving in. It's a different thing in the middle of a pandemic. So you want to make sure that whoever it is on your team, the decision-making group, actually has industry expertise, has the ability to look at levers in the economy, what might happen if there's another downturn, right? And all of that. So we are hoping that by the time these conversations are happening, you kind of have you're not using a gut reaction. I like the poll showing that it's only 13%, I think, of the group had a formal process in place, because I think that's the case that we're finding with a lot of our clients. I luckily get to participate in a CFO roundtable call, and the same question was asked and of the group, and pretty much the metrics and the decision making were kind of based upon rent collections. What is the recent history, and what are they going to do? I would call that an informal process. I mean, each one of them has a different approach. Anecdotally, we're hearing that in the market, the institutional groups have a fairly well-oiled process ready to go, but they're a little bit more slow in making a decision or offering relief options. And the small business owners, the mom and pops, the holders of real estate, may not have a formal process, but are more thorough with the discussion and might get more creative with the outcomes. It's important to have the right team in place when you get into it.
Okay, and depending on everyone's situation, what is the very first thing you would do if a landlord came to you and said, I don't trust these financials? What are the very first steps, Craig?
There's always a risk that a landlord is going to receive financials, but at the end of the day, they're just really numbers on a page. So, and again, this will vary depending on the sophistication of the tenant. But if, for example, you're just not getting a good gut sanity check, the first and simple thing you have to do is ask them to provide you the underlying transaction support. In our world, we call it the general ledger. Is from your accounting system, does the transaction level accounting agree or closely agree to the financials that you've been provided? We've seen numerous times where on the due diligence side during an M&A is potential sellers give potential buyers financials and financial statements in Excel, but not a system-generated financial statement. So ask for that system-generated financial statement, ask for that detail support, and also don't be afraid to ask questions. If there's some unusual fluctuations from one year to the next that doesn't make sense, ask the question. If you're looking at monthly data and there's unusual fluctuations month to month, don't be afraid to ask the tenant the questions of what's really going on. And if you're not getting the responses you want to hear, then maybe your gut feeling is correct. We've had examples when I mentioned numbers on a page, one of our clients engaged us, same thing. They weren't too sure about the financial numbers. They looked great. They were hoping they were correct because they looked fantastic, but just from a smell check, they just looked too good. And so our job was to figure out, okay, well, what generated these numbers? Because again, these financials were in Excel, and that's all we could get. And by the time we were able to get access to the actual accounting system generated financial information, they weren't even close. And so it was clearly that transaction didn't happen because the numbers that we found in the actual accounting system were not even close to what was provided to our potential buyer. Does it happen a lot? No, but it does happen. So it's just something to be aware of. Just if you feel not having a good gut feeling about your financials, just ask for, provide me the system generated financial statements, provide me the underlying general ledger, and then ask simple fluctuation analysis. And if not, then you bring people like ourselves in to help.
So Craig, with respect to financials, we're familiar with what financials are, but specifically, in addition to general ledgers, are we asking for income statement? What type of, when you say financials, what are we looking for from a tenant? This is a question that's been asked.
I would ask for the income statement and the statement of cash flows. And then also actually in the balance sheet as well, because you want to see how much cash they have in the bank. So your simple financials are going to be your balance sheet, income statement, statement of cash flow, and then ask for a forecast. Right? That's another thing too, is if their income statement is here, but the forecast is here, or down here because they're trying to get lower rents, that's something you got to be aware of. That's a great question, especially with the forecast.
Yeah.
Does the forecast really make sense to what the company or the tenant has generated in the past or expect to generate due to COVID?
I think that's a great comment. Sorry, Mark.
I just wanted to point out that on our website there is an example checklist that basically goes through the kind of detail that you should incorporate in that first request, and there certainly would be follow-ups, as Craig said.
Yeah, following up on Craig's comment related to the forecast, making that connection, that's very important. We need to understand, that's why it's important to have a process. The process will help us understand the financials. The financials are the reflection of the business, of the past, what has happened. But now that the world is changing, we need to have an understanding, link the forecast. And what the goal here is, if we're going to provide a rent relief option, we need to make sure that the tenant will recover in some way in the future, and we'll get back to a normal stage of the current business that we have. So the forecast needs to reflect now, what are these new changes or the what if scenarios on the economy? How fast will his industry will recover? What if there's a second outbreak of the pandemic? What if there are new government programs? All these what if scenarios need to be taken into account in order to explain if there's a big gap between the forecasts and the current financials. That will help make a better decision when it comes to the table and say, this is the right rent relief option for you.
All of this is data-based. All the stuff that Craig was indicating that needs to be received is only as good as somebody putting it up against some kind of a screen. And I think there's more to come.
Garbage in, garbage out. That's the concern.
Right. So Abe, can you expand a little bit on the options? You're weighing various factors that impact the landlord and tenant. What are some of the basic factors that you consider when you are recommending or coming up with the options for your clients?
Absolutely. We need to think about this in two terms. We have a set of options that we can provide to a tenant, but we also have some limitations that we need to consider. What are the limitations? First, it's the landlord's financial position and business future expectations. Those are the outcomes that need to be taken into account when you are making a decision. Obviously, we need to also take into account the tenant's financial position, what is their recovery pace, what is their path, how long it's going to take for them to be on a positive cash flow point in order to make the payment back. But during that process, during the procedure, that step, landlord needs to take into account all these what-if scenarios that I was mentioning and assess what these scenarios could have a major needle mover, material impact that could actually put in risk the current rent relief option that we are discussing. we could analyze the financials, come up to a decision. But if there's a high risk that if the recovery is more than 2 years long, the economic recovery for that industry, probably it will not be the best option for the tenant, a rent relief program of deferral for 3 months. It varies, but what it needs to take into account, I repeat, is the limitations that the landlord has. We don't want to start giving rent relief options, and then 1 year from now, we'll have the landlord on a tough position because we did not consider the future expectations, possibilities, and hard hits that could have on his business. So those are the facts that we need to take into account. And also the tenant position. What's their likelihood of recovery? How fast can they recover from this situation? And how can we get to that point where you're in a positive cash flow position and repay back with the rent relief option that we have agreed upon?
Thanks, Abe. So once a process is developed and completed, have you come across any client situations where you concluded that the tenant could pay more than the abatement that they requested?
Yes. A lot of these tenants, and again, this depends on the sophistication of the tenant and their reporting. But if you think about it, we're in a pandemic, and so you may have there may be an opportunity for tenants to sandbag, is not, you know, lack for a better term, their performance. What does that mean? That means they could provide you financial data that says, hey, I'm, you know, my business is suffering, I'm making X dollars, and they're running through expenses into their income statement that may not be related to the business. There's also, you know, ones who aren't doing it out of ill will, but, you know, some businesses their financial reporting is tax focused, so they're expensing a lot of things that may not be purely specific for the business. There may be one-time expenses, non-recurring charges in their income statement that aren't going to repeat. And so what we do is we try to normalize what their income statement really should be and their cash flow really should be based off these one-time non-recurring items. So there's opportunities where we, working with the tenant and the landlord, is to model out that, okay, I know you said you made $10 last month, but in reality, in your net income, you had family members on payroll, you bought your house in Tahoe in the income statement, whatever. But if you back those out, you really could be at $20 a month. And so with that type of analysis, we're able to really normalize what their income stream should be or should have been, which will help you make decisions on, okay, well, maybe you could actually pay more rent than you're actually requesting for us to reduce it by.
And I'll give the flip side of that discussion. Some tenants really do want to stay in place, and they are having a terrible time of it. I mean, we've all heard of the acute effects on retail and hospitality. So there may be reality to the request, and they might be understating how significant this is for their business. And you need to figure that out too, because it would be a terrible result if you gave abatement or relief or applied a deposit against a month payment, and then it turned out a year down the road that their rosy projections weren't real and they go through a bankruptcy process, which we're projecting that there will be significant downturns, and some industries will have that effect. So you need to look at both sides of it, be skeptical, but be pleasant. The more pleasant you are at the time of the conversation, more organized you are, the better data you're going to get, and you can ask some better questions. And I'm sure Abe has a lot more insight on the economic side than we do. You know, a lot of what we're hearing from our clients is that they're going from their gut reactions, the data that's put in front of them, and not necessarily putting it up against that economic forecast.
And before we get into the forecast, Jackie, your comment was we got to when your question was, can I actually pay more rent? It should be potentially, because we need to find that baseline first. And when we find that baseline of backing out the one-time expenses and other items, that baseline is kind of what drives what Abe does with, now we're in the forecast process.
Okay.
Yeah, the forecast.
Okay, we have some, I'm sorry.
Sorry, go on,
Go
Becky.
ahead. Go ahead, Adam.
Just a small comment on the forecast. The forecast it's very important, and because of the time difference, we are seeing right now the situation where a lot of tenants are suffering, and they can show you financials that they already have the impact on their books. But you can also have a situation where their financials are pretty good right now, but there's a lack of on the effects of all this situation. For example, maybe the service industry hasn't had the complete hit of COVID-19, and they will start feeling the effects 5-6 months from now. So that's why you need to connect that part of the forecast. If somebody comes, a tenant says, look, I'm struggling, and the way I'm seeing my projections, I'm going to have a hard time. So I want to start discussing this right now. It's being proactive. Again, it's doing that link and understanding the forecast with the current environment of your tenants. The forecast needs to explain that reality. And it's not as simple as it was understanding an industry. Now the reality has changed. So what will be the reality, for example, of the restaurant industry after COVID-19? Will it be the same, or it will have different cash flows? And same case for each part of each sector of the economy. So that's what we need to take into account when we do a forecast. It's not as simple as saying just add 5% or inflation. Consider the reality, consider all the possible impacts, do an assessment of what other material effects it could have on a tenant and also on you as a landlord.
And now we have some great questions here, if I may ask. The first one, speaking of restaurants, is if you have a tenant with multiple locations and they are telling you that they are closing a couple of them, have you pressed for information about the deals that they have with other landlords?
So, I mean, it'd be straightforward that situation hasn't come across my desk, but what I imagine is that you would want to ask as many questions as possible and get as much data as you can. And certainly if they're asking for something to get out of a currently contracted term, there would be the right for you to receive that data. It would be interesting if somebody said, I would like to have X, Y, and Z, but I'm not willing to share everything. So certainly you should take that into account. Craig?
It hasn't come across your desk yet, but it's only 10:30. So it's still early. You know, at the end of the day, you need to have that trust factor between the two parties to come to a solution. And I would just ask them what their other structures are with other landlords.
Yeah, I think
Incentive,
the economic incentive here is to come up with a deal between both parties. So asking for more information is the right way to go. You need more information to come up with a fair decision on this uncertain environment.
Okay. There was a mention of bankruptcy earlier. What about tenants that are going bankrupt or likely to go bankrupt? What are some options for these tenants?
We have a bankruptcy practice, and so that's probably a question we could get one of our professionals to speak to you about, but definitely reach out to an attorney as well, and we can give you referrals if needed. But one thing is, you know, try to avoid bankruptcy as much as possible. One offering that one of our partners does is he's a certified mediator for distress and bankruptcy items. So that could be one option, is to try to mediate first. But this is definitely a question that we could get you in touch with one of our bankruptcy partners.
I'll add on to that while we're not attorneys, we do hear analogies of, you know, how the situation plays out. And we did have, Craig and I were on a call with a law firm specifically addressing, you know, what are those outs and what are they allowed to do. certain bankruptcies will allow you to negotiate and maintain current contracts because they're necessary. So just because somebody says they're going into bankruptcy doesn't mean they can't negotiate, and then you can't try to hold it up when and if they get to the bankruptcy court. So have that knowledge, understand what the possible outcomes are by talking to an attorney that knows how that works. And then I think also just thinking, what is the negotiation, the best outcome that will allow you to meet your cash flow needs, and you kind of have that as the low watermark, for that negotiation. If they do end up going that direction, there's legal ramifications for the tenant, and they may need to come up with a portion, but that again is for an attorney to look at.
Thank you. There's a couple more, and we had a couple questions prior to the webinar, so I would like to share those with the panel. The next question is, are there any issues with giving percentage rent as well as reduction with personal guarantee to help entice the tenant to stay and keep them afloat so that at least we get something? So the landlord is asking.
Yeah, there's a variety of options that you have in your toolbox: abatement, deferral, lease extension, and rent escalations in the future, applying your deposit, and a mix of all of these things. Moving to a percentage rent is also one of them. You can do all of that. One of the things I've been hearing is that you need to be cautious about whatever you get into, because once you do that, you've legally changed the contract. So you want to make sure that you're making that decision based upon what do you think the cash flows are going to be. And again, what does percentage rent mean for you in the next 6 months versus 2 years? Or what is the term of the lease that you're looking at? The extension, the adjustment to your lease, the extension possibility might actually be a nice outcome for you as a landlord, because you get that security. You're going to have that tenant that you believe in place, and you don't have to go through a vacancy period. So an adjustment to any of those areas needs to be weighed out for the benefit of your product. So hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Mark. Abe, here's a question for you. You started talking about options and limitations earlier. Can you share some of those options specifically?
Yeah, when I was talking about options, I'm referring to the same rent relief options that Mark just mentioned. So we got the deferral, you have a discount, you have maybe a sort of negotiation that you will do within the contract. Probably there's some additional services that between the landlord and the tenant are embedded on the agreement that probably you will take off. So the important part here is, like Mark has been saying, is to be creative and to stay on the table. Let's remember that this is a unique situation, and both parties want to win. And in order for that to happen is to be nice to each other, stay with the open dialogue, and put all the options and limitations on the table. When I talk about limitations, I mean, what's your financial position, your current financial position, and what's your expected future business position from 6 to 9 months from today. So that's the part that we need to take into account. That's where the forecast comes in. And that's where we need to understand that specific industry, that reality, what's changing with this pandemic situation, how things are going to be. If I have an idea of assessing the risk to my business, I can make a better decision, and I can understand what are my pressure points. Maybe I shouldn't go this way because that will get me into a big problem 6-9 months from now. Maybe I should be conservative, or similar to the question that it was just asked, where they were saying, I was able to make this arrangement at least to receive some sort of cash. Maybe that's your optimal position, and that's a good way to go. But the important part is to keep open dialogue, consider your options and your limitations. It's very important.
Thanks, Abe.
And Abe, I would assume you would recommend to clients too is, flexibility is key. And it's going to be, and things are moving so fast. You need a plan A, plan B, plan C, and plan D, which you should have that in your back pocket anyways and kind of see what scenario fits best for you. But flexibility is key, but also too, the ability to get back to normal. So you don't want to lock yourselves in for forever on these new adjusted rent relief options. And you still want the flexibility to, when the ship gets rewrited, that you can rewrite your rents when the time comes.
There's some creative options, that are happening out there. I just recently this morning heard about an office complex in Fairfield that 3 of the 5 businesses in the building have vacated and will not come back. They're negotiating to terminate or have stopped paying their leases. That creates a really terrible situation for the building because it might have been a cascading effect, a domino effect of one did it and then heard and so forth. So that tells you that you should probably figure out, is there going to be an effect on your building, on your geography, based upon somebody moving out? For instance, if you have a large office building with retail along the bottom, if you lose those retail establishments, what does that do to the perception of value in your office? Maybe you have some assets nearby. Is there a negative cascading effect? Another example was that one of our clients had a office building with a nonprofit in it, and the nonprofit, because of the timing, didn't meet the donation timeline, and there were expectations that this campaign was going to happen in March, and it was not going to happen. So they asked the landlord for a reduction, and the landlord got creative and said, well, actually, in a separate entity, they could do a donation to the nonprofit beneficial, and they could get paid. They could therefore tell the rest of the tenants in the building, have you given any rent reductions? And the answer is no. And so that creativity needs to be thought through across your portfolio, but certainly think about the micro market effect of your decisions.
That's why the process is important, because it's not a cookie cutter for each case. Each case is different. That's why having those steps, it's just going to make your life a lot more easier to follow up and make it scalable and repeatable.
Yeah, and having a one-offs here and there for each tenant, and go back to my earlier comment at the beginning, was tenants going to talk, and I can just imagine one gets a better deal than the other, and next thing you know, going back to Mark's comment, you get pissed off tenants who the snowball effect starts happening, and next thing you know, instead of losing 1, you're losing 5, just because you've one-offed and somebody felt they got a better deal than the other guy. So that's why having a process that's kind of fair and consistent goes a long way.
Okay. I'd like to mention a couple of more questions online, as well as pre-submitted questions, just so that we address them. One was, is there any tax credit related to providing deferred rent? And the answer is, currently there is no tax credit. However, BPM is monitoring any changes to those rules, so we will notify everyone if we hear something else. The other one is, I think this relates to some of the creativity and flexibility topic that we are discussing. Have you applied security deposits against rent abatement? Are you working with any clients in doing that?
It has come up that there might be some creativity around what kind of security deposit. I mean, you're sitting on a liability on your books as a landlord. It's the deposit that can be applied in case it's necessary. And the size of that deposit varies by product type and geography. The intent of it is that it's there for security. If you decide that you're going to allow the tenant to apply it, you're losing that security, but you're also removing a liability from your balance sheet. There may be some tax implications to that, and Jackie, I mean, you would know better than me, because the cash flow is no longer there, but you're actually taking the deposit in. But it's a risk and return question. You also get that ability to tell the rest of the tenants in your asset that rents have been paid. And so that might actually be useful as well. But the ability to do it is certainly there. I would want to make sure that your attorney properly papers over that transaction so that there's no question about the deposit being there at the end of the lease. And that's a perfect example of creativity. The other area for deposit replacement is a letter of credit. So you actually might be able to allow for cash flow capabilities for a business. If they can get a letter of credit in place, they might have that available to them. So anyway, you need to have those conversations, and if that's the decision that makes the most sense, it's on the table.
Awesome. We have a couple more questions that seem to be legal questions, but I'm going to go ahead and ask and see if you have any experience. What are some options to dealing with tenants that just simply refuses to pay the rent with no room for negotiations? Is eviction the only path? That sounds like a legal question. But
wow.
Any comments?
It'd be great to get them first at the mediation table, but I'm not sure if that answers it if that person's not responding whatsoever to the landlord.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a client with a building down, a residential and office dual towers down in Los Angeles, and they have a master tenant in the residential side, interestingly, and that master tenant is basically doing corporate lease outs, and they decided to stop paying at one point, and so that the question is on the table. You know, they're quasi-residential, they're commercial tenant in a residential building. So there's other questions about how to go after that situation. If you're talking about commercial versus residential tenant, there's a whole set of different rules and laws, and that's what the attorneys are for. And again, we've got great attorneys in our Rolodex that we can connect you with. But you have to be creative. Craig alluded to, we also have a partner with our firm that is a professional mediator and has his license to be able to sit down and help these processes. It's going to be different if it's an individual versus a company.
I'd just like to add to that question that probably this could also be sorted out on the first step of the process that we have been discussing, where we assess the tenant's financials. I understand the question where he's saying he doesn't want to pay, but we'll probably need to define if he doesn't want to pay because of COVID-19 or because of other facts. I think on that first step of the process, we can understand more and maybe with that start the negotiation, because what we want is to get him on the table. Like I've been repeating, that's the optimal solution for both parties. Maybe that will be the first step to try to engagement. Let me review your financials and see what's going on. If it's something different, then yeah, probably go the other way.
Jackie, this might be a good time for me to share kind of an overview process. This is a general process for how you should structure a rent relief flow. And I'll pop it up on the screen. And this is available at bpmcpa.com. This is a general process. It seems logical to everybody, but it's important for you to think through it, how each of these steps occurs. There's step one, the tenant and landlord application process. Make sure you have an application. Again, we have a list that's available online too that kind of helps you get started in that. And you want to be prepared with it so that anybody that comes to you, you say, sure, here's the process. You get that data. It may not be complete. You need to then analyze the data, but you also need to know your low watermark that I was talking about. So what can the landlord really stomach or financially bear in that negotiation? It's going to be very different for different asset types and geographic regions. The tenant is going to need to provide information, and then you're going to figure out what level of diligence you're going to perform. And that is all within the analysis stage. And then finally, you have options. You have your standard options that we discussed, and there's either yes to one of those options. Maybe it's the option that the tenant came in with, or it's a better one that you're suggesting. If there's no agreement, there's either a litigation process or tell them to go start again. You know, it seems logical, but if you don't actually think through how this works out, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble. And I'll leave this up if Craig or Abe, you have any comments.
Yeah, I like I said, this is the overall process. There could be some tweaking to particular situations, but if we think about it this way, in these 4 steps and how to get to point A to point B, I think it will just make your life a lot more easier from a scalable perspective. If you have multiple tenants asking for a rent relief package, this will get you to an optimal, efficient decision. We understand that could be a little bit overwhelming. It sometimes could be a lot of work for you to come up with that decision. So following these steps, like I said, very high level, I think it could get you there.
To develop this process correctly for your portfolio, you need to have the right team. So you need to have an attorney that knows the product type and, again, the geographic location, and you need brokers ready to give you information about the what ifs. If you don't have that information, you're not going to be able to process the financial projections or know what are the outs. So, you know, if you didn't answer the question yes in the beginning, or if you did and you feel like you might need to make it more robust, you know, start with this process flow and see if you're building to it. No, I can just kind of reiterate some of the key points that we have. You know, do make sure that you have a well thought through process. You have that application ready to go, and you know what you're going to do when the tenant comes in. So you're not kind of designing it on the fly. Make sure that you're consistent with that process. I believe, I'm not an attorney, but I believe that consistency is key for potential later litigation. So you need to be consistent with all of your tenants and document clearly. And speed is important because, Scott Wiener's SB 939 was defeated because of all the opposition, but it doesn't mean that something might come back and be put in place. And that's specifically on the moratorium for eviction and what the process needs to be looked at like. And luckily that was defeated, but that doesn't mean something else might arise. So having these conversations and thinking through, how to make it, how to update those agreements is key. And be nice. Make sure that you are thoughtful and clear-headed when you're sitting at the negotiation table. Think about your tenants' concerns. Think about your own financial concerns, and get the right team in place.
Thank you, panelists, for sharing valuable information with us. I hope everyone has a great day.
Stay safe.
And stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.